Nicola. For those of you who may have seen me before, I may well have been a futurologist at that point, which is an exceptionally silly job title. And at dinner parties always comes with the same question, which I can still feel coming at me, which is, do you have a crystal ball? The answer to that question is yes, I do. Someone very kindly gave me one. Sadly, I saw no future in it. Crystal balls are a bit rubbish, I have to say, in terms of predicting the future. To be honest, I never did predict the future. So I'm kind of relieved I'm not officially a futurologist. I am a principal innovation partner, and although that job title is a lot more boring, my job is definitely not boring. So I work for BT's innovation team. We've got lots of innovators and researchers within BT. I'm actually based near Adastral Park, which is our main research and innovation centre. Some of you, I hope, have come along and had a look around Adastral. So you will know, if you have, that we have a lot of rather strange people there looking at all sorts of things around particularly the network, but obviously what you could do with the network as well. So I work with those guys. I'm actually in a team that largely is responsible for taking a lot of the innovation and research out to customers like yourselves. So working with you to say, well, what have we got? What challenges are we doing? How are we solving some of those challenges? And can we kind of help you? So I spend a lot of time working with all sorts of sectors, not just hospitality, quite a lot with travel and transportation at the moment, a lot with insurance, banking, retail, all sorts of people basically talking about innovation. Now, I am a slightly weird part of the innovation team in that I am a technologist, but only half of me is a technologist, and I am surrounded by very clever technologists as well. So I'm always, slightly scared most of the time because I'm only half a technologist. I'm not sure which half, whether it's the boring bottom half or well, I'm kind of Christmassy today in terms of the top half, but whatever half it isn't, I'm a psychologist by background, and I always claim that I have every right to play in the innovation space because, in fact, technology isn't the dictator of innovation. We're the most disruptive part of innovation. So unless we understand a little bit more about the behaviours, adoption, why people would use technologies, how that changes culture, we can't really do innovation at all. So I'm going to talk a bit about some of the cultural things, some of the people-led things that we're finding. I work on two areas largely. One is the customer, the consumer, and how they're changing. I'm not going to talk about that one too much today. I am going to talk about the employee, who, are, by the way, are the same people. Employees are customers too. So we see a huge intersection between customer experience and employee experience. And in particular, I'm going to talk about the future of work, which is a project that we've been running. Well, I know it's more than 15 years because we celebrated our 15th anniversary of kicking the project off with London Business School a few months ago. So it's been at least 15 years we've been looking at the future of work, which is really strange because, of course, a lot of the stuff we were talking, well, pre-lockdown certainly, came true almost overnight. And now I guess my job is to orient again as we're not out of a pandemic yet, we're just out of lockdowns. As we orient ourselves to the future, where's the future of work going? And I keep saying we're in this interesting, I guess, space between traditional ways of working and new digital ways of working at the moment. And we have an opportunity to redesign the ways that we work. And actually, hospitality probably is right in the center of that. I don't know whether AI made this up, but I am told that company comes from the words compagnie, which is with bread. So actually, hospitality is very much at the center of the future workplace. But we have this opportunity to reinvent work, certainly around food, but for people, we need to make it work for the people actually working in the industry and people obviously working. Can we create good jobs? We have very high levels of disengagement in work at the moment, so how do we create a better job, a better workplace? That hopefully will produce better productivity because, oddly enough, in the past 15 to 20 years, despite a lot of technological advancement, we haven't seen massive gains in productivity. And even the gains that were predicted with AI are being throttled back at the moment in terms of how productive does this make us. Obviously, how do we measure productivity is also a very big conversation because a lot of the measures are industrial measures rather than necessarily measures that were built in the digital age. And then, of course, we have a climate crisis. So if we're going to reinvent work, Let's make it friendly for the planet as well. So people, productivity, planet, they're the three themes that really I'm looking at in terms of that future world of work. But obviously enough, there's a lot of press about the future world. Don't even try and read this. This is just screen captures of headlines. And there's one even this morning. Amazon allegedly has ordered, from January onwards, 5-day work weeks for their employees. Well, yeah, the press is covering a lot of this. If you believed what the headlines said, you would believe that there was some kind of major warfare going on between employers and employees about the future world of work. 5 days a week in the office, scanning badges, monitoring badge swipes. Of course, that means nothing because all that means is someone's in a building, frankly. Doesn't necessarily mean that they're productive. And also, there's something in psychology called rational cheating. I love rational cheating because rational cheating is not malicious. It's just people going, why would I do that? Badge swipes. There is a startup that is, I believe, operating in London at the moment that acts like Uber for your badge. So if you can't be bothered to go in, what you can do is basically say, all right, you can go and pick my badge up from my house. I'll drive it to the office, I'll scan it for you, and then I might scan it again a little bit later. Now, any of you responsible for security will have your head in your hands at this point because that is a security professional's nightmare. But it is a very good example of rational cheating. I mean, another example, certainly during lockdowns, was the fact that the #1 bestseller on Amazon was the mouse jiggler. So if you were looking at people being productive by sitting on their keyboard, get a mouse jiggler and you look as if you're infinitely productive, even if you are walking your dog. Rational cheating in absolute action. So we've got lots of things going on here, frankly, and my role is to not look at the headlines. It's to look at the data and see what the data is telling us, cut through all of the hype, and then see what we're left with. And what we're kind of left with is a big debate. In fact, futurologists have been going on about the future world of work for a long time. I think we're having a healthy debate at the moment. This guy was very brave. Charles Steinmetz, he was an engineer. He predicted back in the 1920s that by 2023, which I think was last year, we'd all be working a 5-hour work day. Hasn't quite come true. However, we have had lots of debates around things like the 4-day work week. That's a very big one, capturing a fair amount of headlines. Indeed, there was a very big trial last year in the UK. It does not work for everybody. In fact, there are a couple of hospitality companies that did actually participate in that 4-day work week trial, one being a fish and chip shop, believe it or not. Now, obviously, a lot of their work's seasonal. So they're down by the seaside. The bulk of their business was in the summer, so they couldn't do a 4-day work week in the summer, but they could in a quieter period. And actually what they found was it helped to retain their employees because it was something very different and something very attractive. And oddly enough, they weren't the biggest payers either. So there are things around this that are attractive to employers. But as I said, a lot of the ways that we work, actually, if we look back at the history of the workplace, and I always say, with futurology, you always start with the past. The ways that we work were largely established in the Industrial Revolution. So the 9 to 5, clocking on, clocking off, the office even as a centralized location to work, all a product of the Industrial Revolution. Even things like productivity measurement, GDP, all of those Industrial Revolution measures, when people were largely doing things that we could measure. And of course, things have changed somewhat. We are now in a digital age where particularly knowledge work is the biggest growing area of the workplace. And knowledge work is very, very different to factory work. It's very difficult to measure it. Is it best done Monday to Friday, 9 to 5? And that got me thinking a lot around, okay, so knowledge work implies using your brain. And particularly as we get AI coming along to help our brains be even more creative, hopefully, not necessarily wipe out all the jobs, more on that later. Actually, the emphasis on our brains becomes more apparent and more important in the ways that we work. So I started to think, okay, are our brains actually built to work Monday to Friday, 9 to 5? And the answer is probably not, and particularly for deep cognitive work. So if we're employing a lot of knowledge workers, largely it's deep cognitive work that they're going to start doing as AI takes away all of the boring and mundane stuff. So how optimal is my brain during an average working day? Well, actually, the evidence points towards, for deep work, about 4 hours. So that's why I keep this quote up, because I think we do need to reinvent work for a digital age. Doesn't mean we're necessarily going to be working 4 hours a day, but we probably do need to optimize our day if we're doing deep cognitive stuff. Now, of course, there are reasons for companies changing the ways that they work. This is actually a survey that I'm hoping we're going to do again soon, because this was about a year and a half old now. But we asked senior leaders why they were rethinking ways that they work. And obviously, the number one that continuously comes up is talent. We want the best talent. We can't necessarily pay the best talent, but we want to attract people into our workplaces. So how do we do that? And actually flexibility comes very high. Yes, salary is definitely in there, but people are willing sometimes to take a salary cut to get more flexibility. So that's the first thing to say, that that's an attractive thing for talent. Now, for frontline workers, that's an interesting dilemma, because of course frontline workers can't work from home. They have to work on the front line, which means that they have no choice on place. But they can have choice on time. So we're getting quite a lot of discussion around things like, obviously, flexible shift patterns, job shares, time bartering, payback schemes. All of those things are very attractive, again, to employees who don't have a choice on where they work, but could have a choice on when they work. And actually also predictability is another one that comes up quite a lot, particularly in your sector, around, yes, they want flexibility, but they want predictable flexibility as well. All difficult to deliver, I know, but that's certainly something that does attract and retain people. The middle bits I'm going to talk about. The one I'm not going to talk about, but was talking about last week actually, was around security, because security is often used as an excuse not to do stuff. Oh, sorry, you can't do that. It's not secure. Now, last week we had a massive security festival at Adastral Park, and talking to a lot of chief information security officers, they were actually saying that's not us saying you can't do it. We're saying, how do we enable this to be secure? So you give us how you want to work, we'll make sure the security is in place. So we can work securely, we can choose where and when we work. Security isn't necessarily the excuse, and I'm not a security expert. As you would imagine, we have a lot of security experts in BT, so if you want a conversation about security, I can introduce you to some people who can literally bore for Britain on it. I'm not going to bore for Britain on it, because let's have a look at some of the stats. Let's have a unpick of some of the data. Now, this data has actually been incredibly stable over the past maybe 18 months. What we are finding in terms of workplaces is that typically if people are allowed to have a choice as to where they work, they typically are coming in they're not coming into an office 5 days a week, they're not working from home 5 days a week. It is somewhere in between. Generally, it's 2 to 3 days a week in an office. This is having interesting effects on the economy. Certainly, there's a donut effect, particularly for cities. London's slightly less affected, actually, than some other cities, but I'm sure you're seeing patterns around hospitality. Certainly, it's busier on a Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, for example. I'm not going to abbreviate that trend because it's slightly rude, but Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays, typically, if people are given a choice, they are the days that they typically are in. We can see even from our mobile and Wi-Fi data in London that Friday in the city is, well, it's not dead, because there are a lot of people coming in for other reasons than work. And actually, interestingly, working with some of the City of London guys, what are they called? Business Information BIDS. They were saying actually it's busier in London on a weekend than it's ever been before. So we're seeing very different patterns in terms of people travelling in and out of particularly urban spaces. And when they're not, actually they're then reinvigorating the areas that they live in. So if you're working from home, the chances are you're spending in that area, you're buying your coffee, you're buying your lunch close to you rather than in an urban location. So there are always winners and losers here. But this is a typical pattern that we're seeing. That obviously, in terms of actual real estate, is producing a pattern, because those Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays are, we're in peak office today. I think it's Tuesday, isn't it? So that's the day that most people are in. But on a Friday, absolute tumbleweed. And again, We need to understand these patterns. Certainly, if we look at offices, we've been looking at how can we actually get the data to the people that are selling the coffee, making the lunches, so that they don't overstock on a Friday. I mean, it may seem obvious, but how can we start to figure this data out and start to predict better? Obviously, there are some companies that are going the extra step. We have been working with a couple of companies now that have decided to just close their offices entirely on a Friday because they're heating, lighting, and cooling an entire office for the 6 people that happen to be in. So maybe it's a strategic decision to close it. Now, again, might not work for everybody, but at least, certainly from a planet perspective, we probably need to think very carefully about energy uses in offices. So we've been doing quite a lot on sustainability in the office space, trying to use data a little bit better, so that if you only got 5 people in, let's not heat the entire building. Let's actually create hot or cool spots within a building and allow people to congregate. Interestingly, one of the things that people always say about the office is it's all about socializing about work. One company I've been working with who has done that, just isolated a floor on a Friday, has said that people that don't normally mix actually start to mix, and that has enormous benefits. Rather than being one floor away from each other and never talking to each other. So we need to understand how these patterns affect our carbon emissions, for sure. So certainly we do have office working. How can we optimize carbon in the office? Home working. How can we optimize carbon at home? Now, there are a couple of companies I've been working with, mainly in the finance sector, actually, that have been looking at carbon incentives for their employees, mainly things like solar paneling at home. Now, you can't force people to do that, but at least it starts to think about how do we actually reduce the carbon footprint for people that are working from home. And then, of course, the impact of hybrid working is that there is some commute as well. So how can we maybe reduce those commutes? Can we make them greener rather than commuting for 2 or 3 hours in a car to an urban location? Can we maybe create spaces that are attractive in areas where people are working from home, where they can get out of the house? And again, I think the hospitality industry has a huge role and is playing a huge role in this, in that often we go to our coffees, I call it, rather than the office. So whether that's a coffee shop, a hotel lobby, or frankly, wherever I lay my hat, that is definitely my office. So we're seeing those patterns emerge. We just need to figure out how to optimize that for carbon. And certainly, I did once go to Hong Kong for a 1-hour meeting. That is definitely not happening anymore, thank goodness. It was also quite tiring. The data towards hybrid work actually does paint a very, very logical picture as to why probably hybrid is the answer, for a number of reasons. Again, for people, for productivity, and also the planet. The data is pretty favourable. If we look at the 2 extremes, 5 days in the office, yeah, great for collaboration and networking. Certainly does support certain activities where maybe there's specialist equipment, for example. Can't usually do that from home. There's a very clear work-life boundary. I know when I'm working and when I'm not working, theoretically anyway. And of course, energy, brand, community, all of that kind of stuff is much, much easier to build in a physical space. But there's a big thing around value for commute here. So am I coming into a physical office space to sit all day on video calls? That is probably not value for commute. People really want to know, why should I be in a physical space? And I think that's a big pressure articulating what is that value? What is the employee value for that commute? It can limit people's flexibility, and that's number one in terms of people's preferences in terms of workplace. They can be distracting, offices as well, particularly if you're on a neurodiverse scale. If you want to attract neurodiverse people, don't bring them in 5 days a week from the office. Having just done some interviews on our neurodiverse community in BT, I didn't really appreciate the impact of the commute on them even. If the train's late or it's crowded, they're going to be a disaster area before they've even got to the office. And then offices are often very big and crowded and light, and again, they're not going to work optimally. And as I said, presenteeism can be a real problem. If you've got your badge being scanned by someone who's an Uber for your badge, all it's saying is your badge actually passed through the turnstile. It doesn't actually give you any indication as to what's going on in the building. And that, again, is one thing. What goes on in the office stays in the office largely in terms of data. So we're trying to figure out what data do we need to figure out how physical spaces are working for people or not. Obviously, 5 days a week at home, we've all done it. We all had to do it. Yes, it's great for autonomy. It can reduce our personal costs. And there is a perception that it increases productivity and potentially does reduce carbon emissions, and also allows you to recruit in very different spaces and areas. And again, people with disabilities or on the neurodiverse scale can be recruited. However, it's also very difficult to do 5 days a week at home. Isolation, loneliness, household distractions, self-motivation, lack of visibility to the boss. All of those things can be problematic. So hybrid kind of is the best of both worlds. So we can see the sort of intersection in the data around the 2 to 3. Indeed, BT has a policy at the moment called free together to wherever. So that kind of articulates generally what we're seeing in the corporate space at the moment. For people, though, the problem often isn't about place. It's about disconnection, as Kevin Kelly says. The fact that it doesn't really matter where I'm working, or indeed when I'm working, because I have a device that ties me back to my work wherever I am. And the problem then is, where are the boundaries? Even if, the boundaries appear to be I go to an office or I stay at home. This is a problem we call techno-stress. We've been working on this problem for a very long time, probably about 10 years. This is some of the research that we've been doing with Lancaster University on it, around if people are having problems working longer and longer hours. By the way, long hours cultures are very unproductive. In fact, if you look at productivity across Europe at the moment, generally the correlation is the shorter the hours, the more productivity we see. And unfortunately, the UK is on the I work lots of hours and I get less and less productive. Obviously, we burn out. That's one of the problems. That 4-hour day thing really does happen. We burn out. So all of these things we have to deal with. I think one of the big problems is this always-on pressure, particularly if you are working remotely. How do you prove that you're working? Do you feel guilty when you go and walk the dog? Well, actually, again, giving your brain a break might be the best thing to do. So actually walking your dog might be a real productivity accelerator because you're giving yourself a break. The problem, and we did some work with Cambridge University on this, largely is the M&Ms. Meetings, messages, managers, all of those three things tend to tie you back to the office. Now, the thing is, you can do something about that. And with Cambridge, we devised a diet. We were going to call it the Cambridge diet, but somebody got there before us. But we call it the balanced communication diet for business instead. It's slightly less easy to say, but like any good diet, it's a 5-step plan to combating those M&Ms. And it is about reaching compromises often around how many meetings do I go to? How do I manage my manager? And how do I manage my messages as well so that I don't have to be always on? Obviously, one of the big issues that we've seen, actually, interestingly, having worked with a few of the companies that trialled that 4-day work week, one of the first things they said was, well, we have to do 5 days work in 4 days. So the big thing we have to do is to cut out the time vampires. And the obvious time vampire is meetings. Now, I don't know about you, certainly in lockdown, this got infinitely worse because I did tend to wake up every morning with an impending sense of Zoom. Now, obviously, there are other platforms available, but this temptation that we have to stack 30 to 60-minute back-to-back meetings through the entirety of the workday is a very unproductive way of working. Now, Microsoft, I love Microsoft Research. They do some nutty things in Microsoft. I love them. They wired people's brains up and looked at their brains during a death by meeting day. And oddly enough, after 4 hours, you could literally see the brain dying. So again, this is not a way of working that we can sustain. So the first thing to say is, should it be a meeting? Because we have a lot of other tools, asynchronous tools, for example, that we can use to discuss things. We just need to understand where is the value of actually talking synchronously, possibly with a meeting, or let's use the asynchronous tools that we have. So that's the first thing. Should it be a meeting? Then, of course, we can overlay an added level of complexity. Let's make the meeting hybrid. Woo! We love those. So half the people in the room, half the people not in the room. The problem then is presence. So I was in a 4-hour meeting last year, and 2 minutes before that 4-hour meeting, I was in the room, by the way, the people in the room realised there were people online. Now, they'd been having a gorgeous conversation on chat. We had not seen that because nobody in the room was on the platform. And this is the clue about hybrid. Firstly, it's digital first. Everyone needs to be on the digital common ground because that is the common ground. It's not the home, it's not the office, it's the digital space. Secondly, it is a moderation problem. We don't teach people to moderate meetings in the physical world. When it gets to the phygital world, where we've got both physical and digital, it becomes incredibly complex. How do we teach people to actually moderate those meetings better? So we've got lots and lots of questions. Now, obviously, technology is still running to catch up on some of this. Yes, there are lots of wonderful meeting environments that we're starting to put in. 360-degree fisheye cameras that can use AI to pick out faces, put them in little boxes. That takes away that problem of the meeting room with the camera at the end, which, if you're in the digital space, you just get, a tapering table full of ant people, basically, that you can't see who's in the room. You can't really interact with them. So that kind of starts to give you a little bit more of a clue as to who actually is in the room. So all of those things we're starting to get better at, but could we get even better using innovation? More on that in a minute. Now, place is an interesting one because place of work is quite important. But when we are physically co-located, again, we need to get that value for commute. Now, generally, again, the places that we work tend to be places that we socialise about work. And again, this is where hospitality comes in as a core, because I think a lot of this is to do with how good's the coffee, how good's the food. We collaborate over food and drink as well. We always have. That has been where hospitality absolutely fits in. You are providing the oil on the wheels for working. So those office spaces are incredibly important to get right, because otherwise why would you go in? And we get lots of peacock offices, they're calling them, offices that look really gorgeous but are terrible to work in. So again, how do we use data better to figure out who's in the office, what are they doing, what areas are they looking at, how are they communicating and collaborating, what spaces aren't being used? Do people like the food and drink? Is it bringing them in? All of those are big questions that we don't necessarily have data about. We know who's in the building because they've swiped in. We know who's connecting to the Wi-Fi. In fact, we can use things like Wi-Fi and mobile technologies to use a lot better to try and understand what people are doing. But we could get creepy. And if we get creepy and take it down to an individual level, we'll probably get rational cheating again. So we need to use the data in a savvy way, but not get creepy about it. Now, I mentioned that obviously home working has worked very well, largely for a lot of people, and still remains a preference, but 5 days a week, maybe not. That office space, I think, is really interesting, though. In fact, that's my local pub at the top there. Have a board at the moment called Work from the Pub. Obviously, that's the POFICE rather than the COFICE. So they're not very busy during the day. So why not offer £10 unlimited tea, coffee, Wi-Fi, and at the end of the day, you get vouchers for whatever you want to do, food or drink. If you make your space attractive and something that offers maybe a green commute, but also good food and drink, that actually could become a new type of office for a lot of people and could prevent them necessarily from going into a centralised urban office. So again, we're starting to, one size doesn't fit all here. We need to understand the data a lot better. And certainly that's something that we're starting to do. This is data I got earlier in the year about giving us a clue as to what people are doing from home versus in the office. And oddly enough, we're seeing face-to-face meetings at home, and I suspect that's not home. That's probably in the COFICE or the POFICE rather than actually in people's houses. Individual work actually doesn't vary an awful lot between home and the office, which is why we probably need to create quieter spaces in the office as well as noisy spaces, because people do need to concentrate with less and less distractions. And yes, we're getting video phone calls. We're doing more from home than we are in the office, but we're still doing a fair amount in the office, which means that we need to build that into the office space as well, because it is almost inevitable that some of our meetings are going to be hybrid. And indeed, I won't go through this data in any great detail because I don't have time, but I think we can start to use our data better around figuring out how spaces are working, particularly if people claim that the reason to be in the office is for serendipitous conversations, those water cooler conversations. The problem is, do we know those are happening even? Do we know that people are colliding? How are people using those spaces? This is actually Wi-Fi data. This is on the MIT campus because they've been doing a lot around where are people bumping into each other and communicating and collaborating. And can we start to measure that? So can we start to look at how ideas are flowing? Now, bear in mind this is a university campus, so innovation and idea flow is pretty important. In other environments, it might not be, but we still need to figure out how those spaces are working. I actually posted on LinkedIn earlier in the week that neuroscientists are starting to work with architects to start to figure out how workplaces and physical environments are working. I did spend an enormous amount of time doing ethnographic studies, particularly of coffee shops, oddly enough, looking at how people worked in them. So we need to get a bit more savvy around, well, who's in our space and what are they doing, as well as what coffee they need. Now, finally, because I am in innovation, I would get my innovation credentials revoked if I didn't mention 2 innovation areas that are somewhat popular, sometimes in a little bit of a trough of disillusionment, and that definitely applies to the metaverse, which is currently residing in that trough. Now, largely, I'm a little dubious about the metaverse. It's science fiction, largely, at the moment. Do I want it to become fact? Do I want to work from a metaverse? Do I want to live in a metaverse? Possibly not. And if you look at science fiction, it's mostly dystopian science fiction. So do I want to live in Ready Player One or The Matrix? No, probably not. So we're not even looking at creating a metaverse in BT, but we are looking at how maybe the tools that might ultimately become a metaverse tool, how would that change the ways that we work? So there's virtual reality, there's augmented reality, and there's mixed reality. Let's do virtual reality first. I call it vomity reality. The clue is in the name. If you put a headset on me, usually I'm throwing up within 2 to 3 minutes. So that's not a desirable way of working for 7 hours, frankly. I think actually VR is incredibly valuable for training and simulation. For other things, possibly not. So I'm going to park VR. Let's look at augmented reality. I think this is a more interesting area, and it particularly starts to blur the boundaries between front office and back office. The classic example actually is the middle there, paramedic. Now that paramedic is wearing an augmented reality headset and broadcasting live high-definition video back to a remote clinician in a hospital. That clinician has a joystick. This is the fun bit. That joystick is connected to the haptic glove that the paramedic is wearing. So the idea there is basically the paramedic can do procedures supervised remotely by a clinician that they would not be able to do unsupervised. And the idea, again, is to stop hospital admissions. So we're trialling that at the moment, early days. We've got a crane inspector in Belfast Harbour, again, augmented reality headset, just a checklist, to be honest, in front of his eyes, not quite as exciting. He can bring in a second opinion if there's something he's not really sure of, because there's a camera on the headset. He's climbing cranes, so we can't give him handheld devices. We're also looking at tethering a drone at the moment onto that so that they can fly the drone around the crane so they don't have to climb the crane quite as much. So there's health and safety implications there. With our engineers, again, augmented reality headset, we're using pattern recognition because they are dealing with plugs and sockets that are all pretty standard. So we can say, you put this into this socket. So for trainee engineers, we can start to boost their productivity right up. For our expert engineers, they can act as consultants. They can literally look through those trainees' eyes, but actually it doesn't necessarily improve their performance hugely. But again, accelerates trainees quite a lot. Then we can get into slightly more exciting stuff around mixed reality. We're doing quite a lot with immersive environments at the moment. You can see an immersive classroom at the top there. This we can use for things like training and simulation. We've got all sorts of road traffic accidents and all sorts of things. Again, phygital environments, because you can put physical things into those environments and then surround them by things that you can interact with in the digital space. We're currently looking at applications for meetings, oddly enough, because if in that 4-hour meeting I mentioned earlier, all of the remote participants were beamed around the walls, full-sized, we probably wouldn't have ignored them. So again, we're looking at how maybe meeting dynamics might change. And then we can bring in an extra dimension. Now, I'm a Star Wars fan, so my current fantasy is not standing on this stage physically in front of you, but being beamed in as a hologram. Now, obviously, because I am a Star Wars fan, I will have Danish pastries on my ears, And I will be saying, help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi, you're my only hope. Now, this is becoming a possibility. Using something called volumetric video, multiple cameras, we can capture someone 360 degrees in real time and beam them. At the moment, you've got two options. The cheaper option is a small avatar, or you can beam them full-sized into something that looks a little bit like a phone box. Again, if you come to our showcases in Wanbrama, our new headquarters building, or indeed Adastral Park, you can become a hologram. Now, we are looking at the moment as what could we do with this? Aside from meetings and presentations, could we use it for customer service, for example? So particularly in emergencies, when there is something that's gone horribly wrong, we've been talking with transport and travel companies around, could you beam customer service advisors in remotely to deal with a crowd, for example? The advantage being that you can't punch a hologram, so there are health and safety implications there. And then I'm going to finish off with AI, because you knew I would. Is AI going to make us enormously productive and allow us to do 4-day work weeks and 4-hour work days? Well, I don't know. As I said, a lot of the big predictions around AI have kind of been retracted. Goldman Sachs retracted a lot of their predictions around how it might impact the economy. MIT have got quite a pessimistic view of how much it's actually going to impact our productivity. So productivity is the main thing that people are wanting. This is actually Microsoft's research looking at the impact of Copilot. So they're looking at productivity gains rather than headcount reductions. Where are those productivity gains? Oddly enough, meetings are one of them, because I don't have to go to a meeting anymore. I can send my Copilot, I can send AI, because AI can figure out what happened in the meeting, tell me who said what, summarize that meeting. So on average, I could save about 32 minutes a day. The question then is, what do I do with that 32 minutes? Do I walk the dog? Or do I just do more work? And I think that's, again, a very big debate, because potentially this could intensify work rather than necessarily take it away. Obviously, this is the mandatory. I couldn't be bothered to do this slide, so I got AI to do it for me. So Copilot did this. It did a reasonable job. The problem, of course, is it can get things very, very wrong. It has a tendency to hallucinate, all sorts of problems there. Air Canada recently got taken to court by a customer because their bot had basically made up a refund that the customer really wanted. Air Canada tried to claim that the bot was not a legal entity of Air Canada. The judge laughed. So we have to be quite careful with AI. I think we need to put a lot of guardrails around it, particularly generative AI. And I think at the moment it's almost heading down into that trough of disillusionment as well. And there's also the elephant in the room. AI is not good for the planet. It eats up a lot of energy. We're seeing data center energy usage soar at the moment as more AI is used. Certainly that slide I produced earlier probably was the equivalent of boiling a kettle in terms of energy. If we get into the higher end graphics generation, that's the equivalent of charging a mobile phone. And again, if we're going to use AI more, let's not destroy the planet. We need to think about this. How do we get AI to be a lot more energy efficient? Lots of people thinking about that at the moment because it's becoming a problem. My take on this is actually, if you want AI to be productive, you've got to bring your people along with you. And I think the problem at the moment, certainly with those press stories, is AI is going to take our jobs, according to the press. And I think the reality is it isn't, certainly for a very long time. Actually, if we can get people and AI, or people and any technologies working together, we have an opportunity to improve people's jobs whilst also making them more productive. So this is much more a symbiotic relationship. But I think that's why we probably need more psychologists in the area, because we need to understand the strengths of the human, the strengths of the machine, and how the two can work together. Because as Albert Einstein allegedly said, although AI may have hallucinated it, if we put the two together, we could get a win-win situation. So I've wittered long enough. If you are interested, there's tons of research and data behind this. Just ping me. Happy to share any of it. If you're having trouble sleeping, it could help. But thank you very much for listening.